Okay. Wow. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Andres. I've had like a bit of a whirlwind last 3 days. I've been hosting a visit from Lee Waters, who, for those of you who don't know, is the Welsh MP who's responsible for getting through so many reforms to their active and sustainable transport. To promote active and sustainable transport. One of the most famous things that he did, and one of the things that he actually risked his life for pretty much, was to reduce their default speed limit to 20 miles per hour, which is about the equivalent of 33 kilometres per hour here in Australia. So it was a very, very brave move. Literally zero infrastructural change aside from street signs, not even much enforcement from the police, a big community education campaign. They've managed to lower the speeds by what they've recorded, not quite to the 25 to 20 miles per hour, but definitely they're on the way down. Their rates of death and injury from traffic collisions have plummeted. So 11 lives were saved in the first 3 months of this speed intervention. So I've been hosting Lee for the last 3 days, and he's quite a character. I can see how he thought that he was the kind of guy who could reduce the speed limit in an entire nation pretty much overnight. And, you know, it's that kind of political conviction and political courage that I think we need more of here in Australia. So to that end, to sort of encourage that political conviction, some of you helped me out to get signatures from 100 of Australia's, some of Australia's leading urban and transport academics, to a letter to government to basically call for them to consider reducing urban road speeds here in Australia. The emphasis in the letter was that we don't need necessarily to do infrastructural interventions before we reduce the speed. Of course, that is great when it happens, but it takes a lot of time. And I announced that the letter was officially presented to Lee last night at a function, and he is at this moment presenting it to our roads minister at a lunch that he's having with him. So hopefully that gets there, but thanks to all of those who helped me to get those 100 signatures. I'll be emailing everybody who did sign. A special thanks to my lovely PhD student, Laia, who really helped me with the administrative side of things. It was a bit of a rushed effort, but we got there. And I think that's just a really important place to start, is acknowledging that a lot of what we do here in engineering, in transport studies, in urban studies, when the rubber hits the road, it's political. We can provide as much evidence and information as we possibly can, and we can make sure we gather that evidence with as much rigor as possible according to world standards. When it comes down to it, it's going to be a political decision. And the bit that I'm really interested in about that is politics is very much swayed by their perception of what the constituency wants. So politicians always want to get re-elected, right? One of the most important things that I learned from Lee over the last couple of days was that one of the reasons he pushed through with this courageous move was because he knew he had a very short political life. He didn't have much to lose. He got elected in a real minority seat. So for him, he knew he wasn't going to get re-elected anyway. What the hell? May as well go hell for leather and propose as much as you possibly can. So politicians are responding to what their constituency wants, and their constituency is us, the people. So it really matters what we think. Because if you think about it in that cycle of political decision-making, if they're responding to what we want, as transport researchers and urban researchers, we need to understand what people want. We need to understand the very depths of the details of why people travel the way that they do. And even though quantitative approaches are so important in doing this job that we have to do to promote more sustainable, livable, economically flourishing, blah, 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 cities, I think qualitative methods are still really important when it comes to understanding that why. Quantitative is really great at understanding what and how, but when it comes to the background of why, sometimes you just got to go out there and talk to people. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about qualitative methods? I consulted my newfound friend, Microsoft Copilot, and this is what I pretty much came up with, he, she, it, they. First of all, that qualitative research is very focused on understanding human behaviour, experiences and social phenomena, aren't we all? From the perspective of those involved. So this element of subjectivity is really, really important when it comes to qualitative research. Understand that you're not understanding something from where you're standing, but you're understanding something from where the person that you're researching is standing. Other collection methods that are common, things like interviews, focus groups, observations, content analysis. In mobility studies, there's increasingly interesting ways to gather data through drive-along interviews, ride-along interviews, walking interviews, photo elicitation, that kind of thing. Photo elicitation is really interesting because it tells you what the person is noticing and thinks that is important for the question that you've asked. So that's where we give somebody a trip to do and a question to go with it, and we ask them to take photos that answer that question for us. It's quite interesting when you do that with kids, actually. There's some really great studies that have got kids to map through photos their journey to school and compared that with the way that kids who travel, compare a walking journey with kids who travel to school by car, and the images are very different. The pace of the images are very different. I've already mentioned the whole idea of subjectivity, but that's also about the researcher as well. So it's very important in qualitative research for us to acknowledge our own subjectivity, for me to acknowledge where I'm coming from when I'm asking a person questions. For example, in my research that I do with parents and private car use, I'm going to be talking a bit about that in a moment. It's very important for me to acknowledge that I'm a parent, that I have the experience of raising a child, and that perhaps changes some of the perception of the things that, some of the content of the things that I might ask people, the things that I might probe people on. And that's not skewing the research, but it's very important to acknowledge that bias as I'm going into the data collection process. And in qualitative research, we actually welcome acknowledgement of bias. We know that it's biased. We're not pretending to be representative. It gives you so much freedom when you can put your hands up and just say, yeah, I know this is not a representative sample, and I know that these people are biased, but I still want to understand what they're saying. So subjective interpretation is very important. It's interesting, actually, a little anecdote with that parenting thing. I started becoming interested in parenting and private car use when I was successful with a DECRA application, which was all about that. And interestingly, that DECRA application, the project was written before I fell pregnant, before I was even thinking about having a child. And it was interesting for me to reflect on how that changed the way that I did the data collection and changed the project, because it gave me so much more insight, having walked a little bit in the shoes of the people that I was interested in speaking to. So it does change your reflections. You might look at some of your more senior academics, not saying those here, obviously, but I know of senior academics whose research interests have shifted and changed according to stages in their life cycle. So we all bring a subjective bias to our research. It's just a matter of, in qualitative research, you have to put your hand up and put it out there. It's very much about context. So as I said, we're not trying to be representative. We're trying to say, in these circumstances, for these people, this is, for example, why they travel the way that they do. It provides rich and detailed data, which is the real gold that is in it. It provides you with more detailed data than what you get when you work with numbers, because you're really digging into what we sometimes call thick descriptions of certain social phenomena. And of course, as I'm about to say, it needs to be placed alongside and work together with quantitative insights. But when it comes to digging deep, going out and using qualitative methods is really necessary to understand that why. So I'm going to go through a few myths about qualitative research. And this is actually taken from a paper I presented at ATRF. So apologies for those who were there, but hopefully it's a nice refresher. The first myth is that, yeah, of course, transport research, don't we use qualitative methods all the time? You know, surely like there's qualitative methods published somewhere. I know of some researchers over in the US who are doing an analysis of the transportation research series of journals, and they're really showing, you know, it's less than 5% of articles published in that entire suite of publications that use qualitative methods. And when you think about it, when you think about as transport researchers, we're trying to understand the way that people travel. Surely we are missing something if 95% of our research is based on what and how questions being answered. So we don't use qualitative methods as much as we think we should. For example, I did an analysis of ATRF publications from 1975 to 2019. I found 6 were based on qualitative methods compared to 2,404 on quantitative methods. So the transport research community hasn't really embraced qualitative methods as much as they have in, say, urban studies, geography studies, and so forth. I'm not going to get into why I think that's the case, but I think it is a definite thing. The second myth is that qualitative research is not taken seriously by policymakers. I counteract that with the fact that policymakers make political decisions and policy decisions not based on the evidence that we consider to be gold standard or objective. They pick and choose their evidence all the time. And as qualitative researchers, we have the ability to tell a story, which can be super influential when it comes to getting attention to an issue for policymakers and also helping them to understand why it's an issue. So this is a cute little cartoon that I like. Joan, I need you to prepare an objective analysis proving I'm correct. It's called policy-driven evidence. And I think it happens much more than what we know in Australia when it comes to making policy. We're picking the evidence that suits a political or an institutional agenda rather than necessarily what is the best evidence. And some people might have seen me talk about this before, but I always use this example. A few years ago, there was a huge disruption on Sydney roads. The Harbour Tunnel was shut down because there was a climate action group that protested and a woman essentially drove a van into the middle lane, parked it there and refused to move. I think she chained herself to the steering wheel or something. Now, that woman was the first person to be jailed for disrupting a road through protest in Australia. And she was able to be jailed because the policy had changed on the punishments for major disruption to road infrastructure a few months prior. That's a huge policy change when we think about it. All I'm talking about with slowing our streets down is trying to save a few people's lives when they don't get hit by cars travelling 50 kilometres an hour. This person is changing the actual legal system that punishes people for protesting on a road. Now, how did that change come about? Well, the roads minister at the time was quoted as saying, "One morning I sat there on the Spit Bridge in that traffic and saw the family next to me in the car, 3 kids in their school uniforms trying to get to school, stressed parent trying to get to work and just go about their daily lives." That really brought home the scale of the interruption. So we felt we had to take action. Now, that change wasn't provoked by best practice, quantitative numerical data showing this road minister all sorts of impacts of what she was going to do. The way she solved it was that she was sitting on the Spit Bridge, saw some kids sitting in the back of a car in private school uniforms probably, not being able to get to school on time, and she was like, right, that's it, I've had it, I'm taking action. So I hear stories like that all the time, and it makes me realise that stories are influential when it gets to getting political change to happen. And qualitative research can be really good at collating those stories and presenting them in a way that makes sense to people who are in power. Myth number 3, qualitative research is only good for understanding psychosocial determinants. So in transport research, there is a lot of psychosocial research that looks at things like habit, the influence of social norms and so forth. That body of research is also dominated by quantitative perspectives, but there has been more use of qualitative methods in that area of research, I suppose, because it's very much based in understanding human responses to different phenomena. But my point is that what, as transport researchers, is at the heart of what we're trying to understand is the way that people respond to structures. So when I say structures, I'm talking about structures of the built environment, the road network, the public transport network, the bike lanes, also structures of the political economy that determines the way that decisions are made So the system of neoliberal governance, for example, is a structure that we deal with regularly as transport researchers and practitioners. But on the other side, you have the way that people react to these things. And in sociological literature, that's called agency. Anthony Giddens was probably the first sociologist to sell a lot of books and make a lot of money drawing on this, this relationship between structure and agency, and he coined the term structuration. Now, where the gold lie in understanding the way that people travel the way they do is we need to look in the middle there. We need to look in the overlaps of that small Venn diagram to look at the way that people interact with their environments. And that's really complex, right? Because people are really, really messy. They come to the task of traveling around their cities with all sorts of historical experiences that they've got in their back pocket, all sorts of cultural things that they appreciate different to other cultural groups. And when I say culture, I don't necessarily mean national culture or ethnicity. I mean the culture that underpins, you know, what it means to be a good parent, for example, what it means to be good at your work, what it means to be successful as a person. They are all traits of culture that people bring to the task of traveling around their cities, and they influence the way that they make decisions about transport. So, pressing the wrong button there. Qualitative research, not just about psychosocial determinants, it's about the interaction between those two things. Myth number 4, qualitative research doesn't produce real data, does it? I listened to a fairly famous podcast, and a couple of years ago, they started an episode. It was all about bike sharing systems, and it said something like, it's hard to get data on this, but I do know anecdotally. How many times do you hear researchers say that? They can't get the data, the numerical data that they need to prove something that they know is just happening. So we say, we do know anecdotally, but we can't get the data, and then we go out looking for the data, and then we probably can't find the data that is representative enough for us to put in our models. But all the while, there's great data right under our noses through the words of the people that we're seeking to understand. Because qualitative research produces data. Trust me, and I'll demonstrate that in a while. But related to that is that qualitative research is not rigorous in some way. Note here I'm saying rigorous, not the word representative. I'll come to that again in a moment. But a qualitative research project is really, really intense. So when you go out, you collect the data, and I'll be talking you through a qualitative research project in just a moment. You end up with pages and pages and pages of transcripts. Say, for example, a pretty stock standard approach to qualitative research is to do in-depth interviews with around 15 to 20 people if you're trying to get a little bit of an understanding of a particular phenomena for a particular group. You might have 100 pages of transcripts or more that you then need to go through and code. In addition to that, after each interview that you did, you will have written down what we call coding memos, which is drawing out the key themes, and best practice is to do that immediately as the interview finishes. So you've just had 60 minutes of sitting, chatting to a total stranger about the way that their kids get to school. And then you have to sit down for another 60 minutes and write down the thematic implications of the data that you just gathered. Those coding memos also go into your data and form what is coded. Now, there's all sorts of different ways to do coding. Most people only know about what's called attribute coding, where you go through and you code certain attributes of the person. For example, parent, 2 kids, uses a car to get to school 3 days a week, says they do it because of time. They're attributes. So that's like really superficial stuff. Then you have to dig deeper and do thematic coding. So they are the themes that are coming up to answer your actual research question. So, for example, why do people travel to school the way they do? The theme of time comes up. What's underneath that? Why are they so rushed in the first place? What are they doing after that trip that they're hurrying off to? What are the reasons that they've defaulted to the private car to do that, even though they could probably walk in about 10 minutes taking about 10 minutes longer than what the car takes them. Why is it that those 10 minutes are so important to that parent in the morning? Why can't the kid get ready earlier? Why does the parent not prioritize getting that child ready earlier? These are all of the things that will come up in different kinds of themes. And at this stage, quite often we'll draw on some kind of theoretical framework that has been posited in other studies and do a little bit of a priori coding towards that theoretical framework. Then we can go on and do a process called axial coding, which is where you compare across your attribute coding with your thematic coding. You end up with a whole nother set of codes, which you can then go back and compare with your thematic coding again. I'm saying all of these terms and talking you through quickly the process just to hopefully get across how complex and complicated it is to do an analysis of qualitative data in a way that is best practice and rigorous. It's not just a matter of, I mean, I review qualitative articles all the time, and it really, really annoys me where people just randomly pick out a few key quotes and they'll say, here are a few key quotes from our interviews. My response is always, how did you code that data? How can you justify that these are the quotes that came up and they're not just your bias intervening and saying that they were the most important things, that you've cherry-picked those quotes to answer the research question in the way that you wanted to answer it? So there's a lot of misunderstanding about qualitative research and what is best practice in qualitative research. It's not just a matter of talking to a few people, getting a few quotes and bunging it in an article. Myth number 6, quantitative research is objective and qualitative research is subjective. I've already said qualitative research, flag waving subjectivity. We don't mind. That is what we're all about, understanding subjectivity. Quantitative research, though, isn't objective either. Research involving human behaviour can never be objective. Why is that the case? Because we are always someone standing somewhere looking at someone else. Our own subjectivity influences everything about the research that we do, from the way that we design our studies to the way that we select our data, to the way we represent that data, to the way that we decide what kind of analysis is rigorous, to the way that we model and model and model and model until we get a model that actually works. All of those decisions are embedded in some kind of subjectivity. Otherwise, I'm really sorry, but AI could do our jobs really, really well. So I think it's time we start to reflect on that subjectivity in what we do in transport research, even when we're doing our quantitative research. Because as I said here, we're always someone interested in someone else. And in that way, you can't get away from an element of inherent subjectivity. So I'm going to go through it really quickly now. How am I going for time? An article that is currently under review, which is all about the way that parents without cars travel and why they travel. How they travel, why they travel that way. I've analysed this data from several perspectives. I've already had a paper published which was all about the context of the onset of parenting and mobility biographies of parents without cars. But this one was particularly about trying to understand why people travel the way that they do when they're parents and they don't have private cars. So its key research contribution is to provide a better understanding of why people travel the way they do. And that underpins all of the research that I do. I want to understand, for example, why people drive cars, because I am convinced that we're not going to get them out of cars until we know that why. We know a bit more about that why. So the key research questions for this particular paper were, what challenges do parents face when they don't have cars in Australian cities? And how do parents overcome these challenges? So you can see how those key research questions filter into that why. Because if we don't understand these questions, we're not going to be able to understand why it is they're able to be parents without private cars in a fairly car-dependent city. So the method that I did, actually, no, just going back. Why am I focusing on parents without private cars? That's probably a good thing to talk about. Parenting in Australia, as in many other cities around the world, particularly those that have grown up over the golden age of the automobile in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 40s as well. Parenting is notoriously car-dependent affairs. We know that households who have kids are more likely to own one or more vehicles. It's pretty simple, and their VKT is similarly much higher. Unfortunately, we don't know quite enough exactly about that VKT, but that's for the quantitative people. No, just kidding. So why was I interested in parents to start with? Because I think it's an example of the high-hanging fruit. We talk a lot in policy-oriented research about the low-hanging fruit. What are the things that we can do quickly that we can change? But I think that there is value also to be had in focusing on the high-hanging fruit, the fruit that's a lot harder to change, because that can give you insights that can filter down through the system. So that's why I'm interested in parents. Why am I interested in parents without cars? Because if they can do it, then we can convince other people to do it as well. We can get insights into some of the things that have enabled them to do that and some of the barriers that they've faced. So I did interviews with 32 parents of children aged under the age of 12 who don't have regular access to a private car. Now you'll see that that participant description is really quite succinct. In qualitative research, it is so important to give a lot of consideration to the way that you select your participants. The more specificity that you can give to it, the deeper you're going to be able to dig to answer a specific research question. So quite often I see people who have done, interested in migrant housing. So they'll do 20 interviews with 20 migrants living in housing. And they'll come up with 20 really, really different stories about wealthy migrants, refugees, living in apartments, living in houses, living in inner urban city, living in outer urban city. And that kind of data mess is really not going to tell you much. When you narrow down your participant selection, you really, really start to get a better understanding at the depth that qualitative research is capable of. I did a study for my PhD where I selected participants based on them being able to get from home to work in the same amount of time by public transport as it was currently taking them to drive. And I did that because I didn't want to talk to them about time. I knew that time was a barrier to public transport, active transport use. I wanted to talk to them about why they drove when they had a time competitive option. But to get to that level of participant selection, specificity, whoop, and analysis. Took an analysis of 1,500 journeys to work to be able to select those. I think I ended up interviewing 20 participants. So there's a lot of groundwork that goes into that specificity in participant selection, but it's well worth doing. So with this particular paper, I use social practice theory to analyse my data using a priori themes that I knew would come up around built environment structures, around emotions and meanings, and around things like cultural scripts. I used thematic and attribute coding, like I just mentioned before, and I subjectively acknowledged I acknowledged my subjectivity throughout the research collection and data analysis phase. So what does that look like? It meant that when I was talking to people, for the first lot of participants I interviewed, I was pregnant. So it was pretty obvious to them that, well, no, actually that's not true because I could have already had kids. I acknowledged I don't yet have children, but as you can see, I am pregnant. For the second lot of participants, I'd had my baby. So I acknowledged I'm a parent of one child. And that allowed me to enter into that conversation, having established that meaning with that person. And it's really interesting actually looking at the two, the different ways that the parents spoke to me. The data that came out in the end was very similar, but the way we got there was very different. Okay, so I said I used social practice theory, which is something that I use quite a lot in my analysis. It's basically just trying to look, bringing that structure and agency argument together, looking at different structures, built environment, economic, political structures, etc., different meanings and emotions that people have, and different cultural scripts. So say, for example, we're talking about people who drive cars to get to work. The structures, obviously the road network. It's also the neoliberal politics that has funded road building, all of that kind of stuff. The meanings and emotions might be things like when I drive my car, I feel safe. When I'm in my car, I feel warm. I feel like I'm in control because I can control what the air conditioning is doing. I feel comfortable. I feel like I'm in my own private cocoon. All of that sort of stuff are meanings. And then we've got cultural scripts, which sometimes in social practice theory is weirdly referred to as skills. But these are things like, it is safer for me to drive a car. I'm a good parent if I drop my child to school in a car. I need to get to work on time, no matter what the cost, and I can't depend on the public transport system, so I'm going to drive my car. I need to be flexible for my work when I finish work, so I'm going to drive my car. All of those things are cultural scripts about ways that we parent, ways that we work, and obviously ways that we travel. And social practice theory is about looking at the overlaps between all of those, the ways that those structures interact with the emotions and with the cultural scripts to bring about a social practice, which is driving a car to work in that example. Now, just a little excerpt of some of the data that I got. I found that one of the themes that we spoke about was navigating public transport systems with kids. Now, from a quantitative perspective, you might look at Opal data, for example, to try and work out how many parents are travelling with their kids on public transport when they're doing that travel, but you're not getting any kind of an idea of what that experience is actually like for them and how they make that work. This particular mum, who was actually an exercise physiologist with a PhD from, I think it was Berkeley, one of the fairly, Ivy League universities in the US, said that she felt like when she was a mum on public transport that she was public property, that she was having a lot of scrutiny from the public around her. And in response to that, she actually started to change the way that she dressed. She used to just get on the train in sweatpants and whatever, but she realized that when she wore a dress, when she was traveling with her two kids, that people gave her a lot more respect. And in turn, she felt a lot more comfortable about doing those trips. So she amended her behavior. And she said, I asked her, how does it make you feel when you were traveling in that way and having that public scrutiny? And she said, look, if I'm honest, it caused depression for a time. The fact I had a bachelor's degree, or she did also have much higher degrees, and a career, but I was worried about people judging me for being on a bus as a mum. It made me feel like a failure. Now I just accept it. So what I'm interested in is how she navigated that feeling of discomfort that she felt when being in public scrutiny as a mother on public transport, because it's that has enabled her to go about her life, in part, without having a private car. So how did she do it? The way that I analysed that was, of course, I brought out the structures and the materials, so things like clothing, public space, the actual transport nodes and networks and so forth. But then there was also this cultural script, which was people would think you're not caring for your child if you're on public transport with that child. You're too poor to have a proper life if you don't have a car, but you have kids. These are cultural scripts that may or may not be right, doesn't matter. They are her perception and they influence the way she experiences public transport. So they matter when we're trying to encourage people to travel in a certain way. The meaning and emotion that was associated with that, she felt depressed, but there was an obvious sense of resilience. And in other parts of the interview, Annie had, the name has been changed, Annie had a lot of pride in the way that she was raising her children, and travelling independently and travelling on public transport was a part of that pride. So my question is, where do we focus in that mess? If we change the public transport to somehow have privatised cabins that reflect a car, yeah, maybe we could avoid that sense of publicness. If we had recommendations for mothers on what kind of clothes they should wear in public transport so that they avoid the scrutiny of the gazing eye of the public, maybe that would change. How feasible is any of that? The cultural script, we can't change that. that is embedded and cemented. They shift and they change and they morph, and I think social media is increasing the speed at which they're shifting and changing, but they're there. There's nothing that we can do as transport policymakers or researchers to be able to change that. But we probably can do something about the meaning and emotion that comes up and helping that mother to deal with that feeling that might come up with her by providing a more supportive and normalizing narrative around what public transport is for example, by promoting a public transport system that very easily and obviously, which is the most important thing, obviously caters for mothers to be travelling with their kids. By making sure our public transport is safe, clean, predictable, that it is built for what I call the mess of modern life, that all sorts of people and all sorts of trips are welcome on public transport. And some of that might be totally unrelated. Some of you might be familiar with the work I've done about dogs on public transport, which is not just actually about the dogs, it's about trying to get a public transport system that caters for all sorts of trips and is openly welcoming lots of different travellers. So to get to that insight took a fair bit of coding, a fair bit of analysis, and a fair bit of soul searching and digging deep with this particular participant. Now, going back to my myths and realities, reality one, qualitative research is not representative. It never pretends to be. And once you acknowledge that, oh my gosh, it is such a weight off your shoulders. You know, in qualitative research, you should never be saying 50% of the participants said that X, Y, and Z. It doesn't matter whether it was 50% said this and 50% said that. What you're trying to elucidate is the different stories and themes that are coming up. So that's the first big red cross for me when I'm reviewing a paper reporting qualitative research. If it starts to talk about the numbers of their participants grouped into different themes, that's not the way that researcher has obviously misunderstood what they're trying to do with qualitative research. But the most important thing is this concept of triangulation, which I feel like we all learn when we first start doing research, but we somehow conveniently forget as we slot ourselves into our different methodological specialties. That's the deployment of multiple methodological resources or practices in the study of the same phenomena. So in truth, I probably shouldn't be putting that particular data in a single paper. Or maybe I should, but I should be publishing it alongside some quantitative analysis that goes with it to be able to either explore, you know, to be able to explore some of the themes that have come up in a quantitative way. Perhaps I could do that by saying, you know, we've analysed Opal data and we know that not many people travel with kids on public transport. Here's some of the reasons why. Or I could say, well, I'm going to use these themes that have come out of this paper to design my own travel survey and put that out to a representative sample somehow. That's what triangulation is about. And I do think we miss that as an opportunity and also as an element of best practice. Now, triangulation is, I think I sort of mentioned this, where research is an iterative and integrated process. So I might start with big data, I do some interviews, some observations, I do a bespoke travel survey, I have a stakeholder workshop, and then I go back and do some more interviews to clarify what I found. Now, in the perfect world, if we all had unlimited research budgets, that's what all our studies might look like. But I think it's at least worthwhile us thinking more about ways that we can better integrate qualitative and quantitative methods in transport research.
Can you finish now?
Yes. No, this is actually my last one because this is one of my favourite quotes in the world. And I love this picture as well. It's written by a sociologist. I think it was William Cameron in 1966, often attributed to Einstein, which is kind of weird because I don't know why he would have been making comments on the value of qualitative research, but anyway. And Cameron said, buried in a fairly hard to access sociology textbook, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So the gold in that for me is twofold. So for a start, not everything that can be counted counts. I think it's time that we stop using the excuse of a really great data set to produce research when it's not necessarily answering an important research question. So many times I see the data that we have available drive the research question, and it needs to be the other way round. Okay, it's great to have data sets to practice on and develop new methods on and things like that. But when it comes to contributing to our scholarly understandings of that key question, why do people travel the way we do? We need to tailor the data that we're using better, not just rely on, oh, well, we've got this bit of data from here and we can get that from there and this from here. It needs to be more rigorous than that. We need to fill in the gaps. We need to stop putting as addendums at the bottom of our research papers, we should have included this, but the data wasn't available. Because that to me is not good enough. I know that we have to do that from time to time, but let's try and limit the amount that we do that. The second bit of gold that comes from this for me is that not everything that counts can be counted. So not everything that matters when it comes to answering that research question, why people travel the way they do, can be quantified. Some things we just have to throw up our hands and admit, we can't put numbers to that. We can't weight that. We can't model that. But we can acknowledge our own subjectivity and still include it in our understandings and in our research. So with that, finish up. Happy to answer questions. I'll ask a lot of questions too. Thank you.
Question in the chat before, very concrete, whether the list of 6 qualitative papers from it is available somewhere.
No. The actual papers that they were?
Yes,
No. How did I get to that number? Not super rigorously because I'm a qualitative researcher. No, I went through all the proceedings and searched the most commonly used methods, focus groups, interviews, photo elicitation, that kind of thing. So I had a list of, I think, about 10 different terms, and that's how I identified those papers.
Okay, so now a few questions in there. So from
I think David went first.
okay.
Yeah, David's hand was up first, I reckon.
Okay, so Annie, was Annie American? You said she went to an American university?
She was American, yes.
Okay. So one, the view of Americans of public transport and having to ride public transport is different than the view of Australians and Australians having to ride public transport. So say she's not representative because of course no one's representative of the whole group, but that is something to note. Second, who is she afraid of being judged by? Other public transit users or people who weren't using public transport?
She said other public transport users because the way she explained the experience to me was on the bus.
So she was worried that other people would think down on, other people also using public transport would think down of her for using public transport.
With children. Traveling with, you should not, no, her thing was not, I should not be a woman on public transport. I should not be a person on public transport. I should not be a mother on transport with my children. Because if I was a proper mother, surely I'd have a car. So, I mean, in response to that subjective experience that she brings with her, I do think that's important. In the paper, I do acknowledge because a lot of the participants were international, not necessarily any more so than Sydney. So there is a lot of diversity in there. But I think what matters is that that's the way she was feeling.
Well, I mean, I think, for her, it certainly matters that that's the way she's feeling. But for society, there's things we can't fix and there are things we can fix. And that's something that we can't fix, right? Thinking that other people are looking down on you who are in exactly the same position as you are.
Well, I argue that we could, our public transport system is definitely not necessarily only by its clientele, but by the way it's operated, by the timetables, the structure, the way our carriages are designed and so forth. They don't welcome diversity like families traveling.
Well, the trains, and the trains are great. Most of them, you can have the trains so that the seats face each other. So you can actually accommodate families pretty well.
Some stations still don't have lifts.
Yeah, it's in process, but yes.
So it's not a,
I mean, I'm not saying it's the most family-friendly type of thing, but it's really reasonably good. And so that the question I have is that of the things that a public policy maker could then take from this,
Mm.
that particular feeling, I mean, we could try to raise the status of public transport in society. But I don't know exactly how you would actually do that. A marketing campaign doesn't seem like that would actually work on the levels of money people are willing to put.
Yeah, it's not the specificity of that example. So I guess you need to think of it, that's one row in a database. And what I was drawing out was the fact that these cultural scripts come up time and time again in lots of different interpretations and iterations. And that the people who were living without cars had to confront those cultural scripts in doing what they were doing. So, you know, maybe the cultural script of you're a bad mother if you let your child walk to school without supervision under the age of 10, for example. And I think that the value of understanding that, if anything, is that it says to policymakers, this is a really deeply ingrained problem. And if you want to get anywhere near the climate targets that we're setting and the mode shift targets that we're setting, you got to throw a whole lot more at it than what we're currently throwing. Because it's complex, it's deeply embedded. And look, here's an example. So I think aside from looking at the specific policy recommendations, I think it would be a mistake if I based my paper or my contribution around that. It's more about exposing the sheer complexity as a way to get them to take it more seriously, I think.
Sorry.
I don't know, you're the chair, Andre.
Sam and then you, and then we have another question in the chat.
Me?
Yes.
Okay, I had a methodological question. There's a huge amount of research in linguistics, which kind of bridges the qualitative with the quantitative. So, so way back in my PhD, I used methods from what's called latent semantic analysis, where we are looking at language structures and how sentences and words encode meaning. And there's a whole quant side to it, because the motivation is to understand and uncover the sort of nuanced semantic, so the syntax. So I think it's a famous Noam Chomsky example. Green ideas sleep furiously in my head. If you give this to a computer, it would, because it's just quant model running, it makes perfect sense. But to a human being, this is a nonsensical statement, right? So the whole lot of methods which actually starts to then look at how coding happens and how we can uncover semantics as separated out from the syntax, right? And the whole objectivity versus subjectivity question. So I really want to understand, is there a sort of bridge that can be built, or is there already existing, like in the qualitative research studies, what part of these methods are actively used, and vice versa, what part of the coding that you described is actually employed in some quantitative research? Because the whole of generative AI, the whole of large language models, there's a huge overlap between the qual and the quant.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot there, Som. But I'll start with how much is that kind of content analysis basically used in qualitative research. I think it's used when people first start out, because I think they like having the idea of, you know, searching for different terms and looking at the regularity that those terms were used. And perhaps in some research questions, it might be more appropriate than in others. My issues with it is, first, it misses intonation. So I'm not so much interested in the exact words that were said. I'm interested in the meaning that's trying to be communicated. It's very difficult to get that meaning from just a quantification of different words. That's why I was emphasizing that need to do those coding memos. As soon as you finish the interview, you need to go in and say, what were the themes that were coming out of your head? And as you become more and more experienced with doing qualitative research, you don't need a word count to tell you that the word, the phrase bad parent is going to come up a lot when you're talking to parents without private cars. Like, I think that it's risky because I think it lends that kind of idea of wanting to somehow represents one theme more over the other and having some kind of objective way to demonstrate that. So I would hate to think that we could think that content analysis through generative AI could replace what a human being could do when they're sitting talking to another person, the meaning that they're making, the different phrases, the different the ups and downs of their speech, the different pauses that they take, the way that those pauses are peppered about the, I mean, of course, yeah, you could get all of that probably through some kind of generative AI if you trained it well enough, but I can do that. Like, yeah, and I'm not looking to scale up my 20 research interviews to 50,000 and be able to press a button and say, well, these are the themes that came out. I'm looking for creating that meaning.
It's something very interesting that you're pointing. This is what I was asking,
Mm.
is the fact that there is meaning which is not syntactically expressed ever
Mm.
in language.
Yeah.
So, and if it's not syntactically expressed, you can't program it into a computer.
Well,
You can't represent it.
if you record the conversation, you could train the AI to identify the pauses and with appropriate training, the meanings, the intonations. I don't think that it's one level beyond where we're typically at right now, but I don't think that with 5 years, that's out of scope.
Probably not. I still like talking to people though.
Someone has to ask the questions, and I don't know how well the AI asks them.
Yeah, and it's,
We'll all be in the matrix.
yeah.
Already in the
Yeah,
matrix.
I actually had hello Jennifer, I actually had a reflection on David's comment, question, and then a reflection, sorry, I don't know your name, which was going to be my own question, but anyway, look, in terms of Annie's interview, I don't know if this gives you any confidence in terms of your myth that policymakers, or I might be thinking investment planners in the government sector in New South Wales don't use qualitative analysis to make decisions or to support decisions. What that interview reminded me most of is numerous focus group type interviews that I've seen when I was in government, where the discussions were around how to inform the design of a new public transport product. So I think, you know, and you might say, well, yeah, that's, you know, that's imposing, that's kind of post hoc imposition of a, you know, tweaking at the margins of something which government is already just going to do. But, and it might sound silly, but what David said about people in the US having different attitudes towards public transportation reminds me of Margaret Thatcher saying that
She never said that.
if a man is on a bus,
That fast.
Yeah, she never said that. It's
like, well, maybe Einstein said it.
Some-
no. It's actually a really good story. So the real world character who Ian Fleming's James Bond, Miss Moneypenny was based on, is the one who said that.
Oh,
So the real woman upon whom Miss Moneypenny was based.
All right, so I've got a project for when I get home to dig into that. Anyway, someone said, and certainly it resonated with people at the time, that if a young man finds himself on a bus at the age of 28, something like that, he's a failure.
Yeah.
So Annie's interview reminded me of work that was done that led to a point at which the B-line buses on the northern beaches are A, double-deckers, and B, yellow. And I don't want to go into the detail, but if you've traveled on a double-decker bus with kids, you know it's a very different experience.
Yeah,
It's lovely in many ways. And my younger daughter, having had a boyfriend who lived in DY, she would report on that too. Not quite a child, but you know, I digress. But so that qualitative research, I think in parts of the government is well understood as something that can inform decisions that go to cultural distinctions around transport use. My actual question has to do with, what do you think are the particular challenges for qualitative research in the transport space in such a linguistically diverse setting as Sydney. I look around rooms like this and I do see a cohort of researchers for whom English is not the first language. And I'm thinking your interviews, they're very around narrative and verbal communication in a shared language. I know that you would interview people for whom English is a second language, but I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
How that changes.
Yeah, how that changes, how it makes it more difficult or whatever.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's increasingly an issue. We do in ethics applications, we'll always say that we need to get the participants to sign off that they are proficient enough in English to be able to understand what we're doing. So it's unethical to interview somebody who is not proficient enough in English to be able to understand what's going on. I know that sounds a bit airy-fairy, but you can pretty much, you can tell straight away. And I have terminated interviews early because I've said, no, look, sorry, I don't think we can progress because I don't think you fit the participant selection criteria. So sorry, I'm going to have to terminate the interview. Here's your $50. My bad, etc. So it is important to have a certain level of meaning making. I've never been involved in a project that has used an interpreter. That would just add a whole level of complexity for me because I rely so much on my, my experience and I hate like skill relating interpersonally with my participants and bouncing things around. So I would find that quite tricky. But in many cases, you can overcome language barriers really easily by shifting the way that you're asking different questions. So always when you're doing an interview, you'll have an interview guide, which it won't actually have questions. It'll just have points that you want to cover. And the key is to get in between those points, like the probing and the lead on questions. Oh, can you tell me a little bit more about that? How did that make you feel? Why do you think it made you feel that way? I'm really interested in that. Let's go back to that. And in that way, you can really start to create meaning making, even though there's language barriers there, I think.
Okay.
Quite often people, I think, are much better speaking. Well, no, actually, that's swift generalization. I shouldn't say that. Going back to the bus thing, though, when I was at school, the bus was called the Loser Cruiser.
Well, it was called the antecedent to the B line was called the Hell 90. It was the L90, which stood for limit.
The Hell 90.
But it was known on the beaches as the Hell. Used to catch fire.